Good morning, y'all. How's it going? Welcome back to Seed Plate channel. We're having some morning garden time. I'm not fully awake yet. But I wanted to do a whole video just about tomatoes. I don't want this to sound as conceited as it's going to sound, but here at the community garden, I am actually known for growing really good tomatoes. And people ask me a lot how I manage my tomatoes, what I do, all that good stuff. So I'm gonna make a video about all of my best tips for growing tomatoes. I'm also here this morning because we are supposed to get a bunch of rain tonight and tomorrow, which is amazing. We've had a very hot and dry spring. But I have some really large tomatoes, especially here at the community garden, that I want to pull, because what'll happen is if you get a bunch of rain and you have a full-grown tomato that's starting to blush, that tomato's 100% gonna crack on you, and then you're not gonna get a tomato, and that's really sad. So I also have some fertilizer. I fertilize my tomatoes usually only twice, really like right after they get put in the ground, and then also I will fertilize them probably like halfway through fruiting season, so like right about now. And yeah, so we're gonna see some tomatoes, good, bad, and ugly. We'll talk about pruning, we'll talk about watering. I'm just gonna kind of do a brain dump of everything I do to successfully grow tomatoes. So first things first, let's get into some plants and look at this. I've gone over this in a few other videos, but I grow determinants and indeterminants. I grow determinants to make sauce. I grow indeterminants for fresh eating all summer. So let's get into it. So this first little bed, these are all actually San Marzano tomatoes. And these plants have always been a little bit finicky for me, to be honest with you. So you can see like this one got some kind of disease that's even like affecting the topmost portion. So I'm actually probably gonna cut these tops off, and there is some new growth springing out, so that's totally fine. But San Marzanos are like a semi-determinate, so I actually do not prune these. So I'm not surprised that we've got some dead stuff going on. So I'm not really a harsh prune or no prune person. I think it really depends on your goals. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. So if you live in a hot climate like I do, and your goal is to just grow as many friggin' tomatoes as possible, it's probably gonna behoove you, that was a good word, vocab word of the day, it's probably going to behoove you to not prune as much. And the reason for that is, in my opinion, blight and other fungal diseases are gonna take your tomatoes at a certain point anyway. So really, if you prune heavily, you're just kind of reducing the amount of fruit that you're gonna get. Typically, I don't mess with my tomatoes after like July, like mid-end July, because it's just not worth it to me to slave over them, to be honest with you. However, with that being said, I will come through and stuff like this, we want to cut this off. This is like not good for the tomato. We don't want our energy being put into it. I'll come through and cut stuff like this just completely off. This tomato looks like it's in a rough spot, honestly. You know what? We're actually just gonna take this whole thing's head off. For me, I take the approach with stuff like this that if it looks like it needs to be cut off, you should probably cut it off. The thing with that is, your tomatoes are gonna get blight. Like, that's just a thing that tomatoes do in the South. So don't kill yourself over like trying to save your tomato plants, because every type of vegetable, even tomatoes, has a season, and then the season ends and your plant tells you when it's stressed. San Marzanos, to me, they're not really worth growing. And actually, San Marzanos are really just another paste tomato, because they're technically not proper San Marzanos unless they're grown in San Marzano, Italy. So it's kind of like champagne. So champagne is technically not champagne unless it's grown in Champagne, France. So in regards to paste tomatoes, that's kind of how I approach things. They're beautiful tomatoes, and a tomato that is this color will ripen really nicely on the counter. Now, I won't remove this plant at all, even though it looks pretty rough, mostly because it does have some new green growth growing out of the bottom, and that's another kind of advantage for not really heavily pruning the way a lot of people do, because you're actually letting the plant just kind of regenerate itself. Now, let's talk about watering. That's something that I think a lot of people who grow tomatoes really royally mess up. So even a tomato that's like this light, as long as it is kind of turning red, you can go ahead and pull it if you're at risk for potentially cracking. Okay, so watering. This is an important conversation because this is where people mess it up the most. Tomatoes do not like to be watered every day. They like to be watered deeply and infrequently. I only water these tomatoes. It's been 100 degrees here consistently, and I only water these tomatoes 2-3 times a week. I put it right at the base of the plant. I water it probably to the count of like 15 at least. And that is how I water my tomatoes. And again, that's where I honestly think people mess up tomatoes the most, is on the watering, because if you overwater tomatoes, they will be very stunted, very stunted, and they won't produce well for you. This tomato is 1 brook tall. This is Aroma, and I only water this tomato twice a week. So tomatoes kind of like to work for their water, if you will. Okay, also let's touch on fertilizer. I don't measure my fertilizer, so don't ask me how much I use. I go through 1 of these bags a season and I grow a lot of tomatoes. So the most important nutrient for tomatoes, especially at the beginning, is nitrogen. They rely a lot on nitrogen to put on a lot of green growth. So if you guys get a decent amount of rain in your area, then you have a lot of bioavailable nitrogen. So nitrogen from rain is able to be uptaken through the roots at a really, really easy level for plants. If you do not have a lot of rain like me, you're going to want to supplement with some kind of fertilizer that has nitrogen, or make sure your soil has a lot of nitrogen in it before you plant. So we covered watering, fertilizing, planting. This is a very important part of the success of a tomato plant, which I know sounds kind of stupid, but when I plant my tomatoes, you want to plant those suckers deep. Like, I will plant a tomato plant that's probably like at least 18 inches tall, and there will only be 6 inches of that tomato plant above the ground. Tomatoes like to be planted really deeply because all of the little hairs on the tomato plant become roots. And so I really rely on a few things for my tomatoes to be successful. I plant them really deeply to get them a really established root system. I find in general with gardening, the more you focus on the root system of the plant and the more you focus on your soil quality, the better your garden is going to be. Okay, y'all, so we will show you what my backyard tomatoes look like as well. But another massive part of your tomato growing success is going to be to have a proper trellising system. Now, I'm not saying that my trellising system is proper because let me show you, it's literally barely held together, if I'm being honest. I just picked up this plant and tried to tie it up to this stake. This tomato cage is literally tied to this T-post because it was leaning. Y'all, I attempted a Florida weave. I really did. Didn't go well, I'll tell you that much. There are a lot of different tomato trellising methods. If cages work for you, use some freaking cages. If I have some Amazon cages that I really like because they're easy to take down and put back up every year, and you can store them easily. But I've been trying the Florida weave, I've done cages, I've done a lot of different stuff. And I think in my most ideal world, an ideal tomato trellis is Jess from Roots and Refuge Farm at her old farm used to have these cattle panels that were just tall, and they would just go shoo. And I would love to implement something like that. I think it's the easiest. I think it works the best. You just tie them to the cattle panel as they get taller, and it's just this really cool wall of tomatoes. So that's what I plan on trying in the future, but for right now, sometimes you just gotta make it work. So let me show you all the tomatoes we grabbed today, and I'll show you why I grabbed them. So some of these probably look pretty green to you, like this one. So I grabbed this one because tomatoes will be very, very green. And then they start to lighten up to this lighter green. And then once they hit this lighter green, they start to do this, which I think it might be kind of hard to see on the camera, but this is like a yellowish situation. Then they kind of start doing this and they start turning reddish, and eventually you get here, which is very red. This one was hiding from me. So we got some really fat tomatoes. This is an Invincible. This is a determinate I'm growing. This is very green. I'm gonna see if it ripens this week. If it doesn't, I'll just make fried green tomatoes or green tomato chutney. But it's definitely worth, if you have a tomato that you really wanna save and you think that it's savable, just go ahead and pull it. And if it doesn't ripen, you can still use it. But it's gonna be really sad if it cracks. If you wait and then it cracks, you're definitely not gonna be able to use it because it's been exposed. So let me go show you, these are all determinates here. Let me go show you the indeterminates in the backyard because those are just a tiny bit different. Hey y'all, okay, so we are now in the backyard garden, and somewhat ironic that I'm filming this video right now because I just watched a squirrel take one of my big striped Fred's tie-dye tomatoes, and I've never actually wanted to kill something more in my life, so it's fine. Lana's ready for a command. Look at her, she's standing at attention. But that's not why we're back here. We're back here to talk about these. Oh, squirrel is bold. I have had at least 4 tomatoes get stolen from the squirrels today. And these are all my special heirlooms, so I am hanging on. So, here in the backyard garden, it's nice because I have this fence that my indeterminates can lean against. I also do a Florida weave, and you're gonna notice that these tomatoes, they are a little bit taller and skinnier. So, whereas at my community plot, you probably notice they're much more bushy, and that's because my community plot gets at least 10 hours of sun. My garden here in the backyard during the height of the season maybe gets 7 hours. So the tomatoes get taller because they're trying to like reach for the sun. Okay guys, we're back. I actually couldn't finish the tomato video the other day because I was so upset and distraught about how many tomatoes have been taken by the squirrels. So I'm here today, 2 days later, after I have calmed myself to finish talking to you about tomatoes. So with tomatoes, a few more things. Okay y'all, so a few things I didn't touch on the other day. One of them is pollination. If you have any type of wind, you don't need to pollinate your tomato plants. It's not a thing that they need. A manual, it's not like cucumbers where you need bees to pollinate things. So in regards to pollination, in most environments, you're gonna be totally fine. If you feel like your tomatoes are not forming fruits, it could be a pollination issue in which you literally just need to like shake your plant, which I know sounds weird, but the tomato blossom actually has everything in it to pollinate itself. It just needs a little movement to move the pollen into the stamen and the whole thing. So pollination, you're probably fine. If your tomato plants are not forming fruit, look at the temperature. That's the first thing to look at. For example, our tomatoes really have struggled this year because it got really hot really fast. So typically when it's over 90 degrees, your tomatoes are not gonna pollinate. The blossoms are just gonna fall off because it's too hot. So that can be an issue with pollination. The other thing to look at is, does the plant look healthy? Because if the plant is struggling to survive, it's not gonna put off blossoms and it's not gonna reproduce. So yeah, the super ironic thing is that my community garden tomatoes are killing it. My backyard tomatoes are being poached by squirrels and not killing it as much, which these are all of my heirlooms, but tomatoes are tomatoes. So let's talk about after you pick a tomato, what to do then. Hey y'all, sorry, I know the light is literally terrible, but the sun's not up enough to like bring the light in through the windows. So I wanted to show you guys how to get your tomatoes to ripen. So I know the other day we actually picked some of these tomatoes together. And the way you get them to ripen is by putting them all together, and they give off propylene, I think it's propylene glycol gas. And that's how a tomato becomes a ripe tomato. So that's how they redden up. So if you put them close to each other, they will start to get red. Now a couple of the big guys that we picked the other day are starting to get red. And then we have a couple that are not turning red. So we might be having fried green tomatoes this weekend, which is totally fine. I am glad that I picked them because we got 2 inches of rain, and these tomatoes are so big that they definitely would have had some issues. So that's how you can kind of quote unquote like force tomatoes to ripen. And now I get to add all of these to my canning that I will be doing today at some point. I kind of have to do it today, like I don't have a choice. But the other thing you might notice that I'm doing with especially the big tomatoes is I'm actually storing them upside down. And there's a few reasons for that. So your tomato is always going to ripen from the blossom end. So this is kind of where the flower forms, and then the fruit forms behind the flower, and it pushes the flower off, and then your flower falls off at this little point right here. So your fruit is always going to ripen from the blossom end up to the shoulders. These are the shoulders of the tomato. And so when you have a tomato that's ripening like this, if you store it on the end that it's ripening on, that's the end that's gonna get soft first, and it's going to create a rotted spot on the tomato because the weight of the tomato is pushing down on the softest part of the tomato. So the hardest part of the tomato is gonna be the shoulders. So that's why if you're waiting for them to ripen, you want to put them shoulders down and blossom end up so that that doesn't happen. And like I said, some of these, I don't know if they're actually gonna turn. Like these haven't started turning over the last few days, so it's very possible that they don't. But like I said the other day, I would rather pull my tomatoes early and at least get like a green tomato chutney or fried green tomatoes and have my tomatoes crack and explode, and then nobody's getting tomatoes. So I'll probably do a whole separate video on, you know, the ways that I like to preserve tomatoes. But just to give a very brief overview, before I kind of got into canning, which I don't have any special equipment to can. I use a water bath canner, I use the ball canning jar book, easy peasy. So before I got into canning, I actually froze everything, and it's super easy. You literally just boil your tomatoes for like a few seconds, you plunk them in cold water, you take the skin off, and then you throw them in a bag and throw them in the freezer. So tomatoes are super easy to preserve, which is why I grow so many paste tomatoes, because I want to be able to make like chili and pasta sauce and all of that stuff all year round. So that's just a quick note on storing tomatoes. So I think I dropped all my tomato knowledge. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and if you have more tomato wisdom that I did not share, please feel free to offer it in the comments. So, as always, thanks so much for watching. Happy gardening. We'll see you next time.